I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. In 2022, investment in biopharmaceutical companies, pipeline activity, and the launch of novel medicines all dropped from the previous year. A new report from IQVIA's Institute for Human Data Sciences argues the downturn after two record-setting years is a post-pandemic return to longer-term trends. We spoke to Murray Aitken, Executive Director of the IQVIA Institute for Human Data Science, about what happened to the biopharmaceutical sector in 2022, how to make sense of the data, and the shifting landscape in therapeutic and geographic investments. Murray, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Great to be with you today.
We're going to talk about the IQVIA Institute for Human Data Science's new report on the biopharma R&D landscape, how pipelines are changing, and the state of funding for the industry. The report takes a more tempered view than most on the 39% drop in investment flows into biopharma in 2022, seeing this as a return to pre-COVID levels. How concerned should people be?
So the way we look at it is really taking a longer-term view of the trend lines. And I think the further we get away from 2020 and 2021, the more that those 2 years look like truly exceptional years. They were clearly exceptional as we went through the pandemic, but they were also exceptional in terms of the very high level of funds flowing into life sciences. In 2022, we saw that we saw a return to trend essentially, and I think we, in a sense, should put those two exceptional years aside. They brought in what looks like about $120 billion in excess of what would have been expected. But I think those days are over, and we're back to what is still a positive trend for funding, even if it's down from the level that was seen in 2021.
At the same time, R&D funding by the 15 largest pharmaceutical companies hit a record $138 billion. Is this good news? Does it reflect a problem with R&D productivity, or is it the industry bracing for a new patent cliff?
Well, I think the industry continues to, frankly, double down on its strategic focus on innovation in R&D, and we've seen the large companies over the past several years really reduce some of their business in other areas in order to really put the focus purely on R&D investment. And indeed, that level hit a high point in 2022 at $138 billion, just on 19% of revenue, which also reinforces that this is an industry that puts its money where its scientific ideas are, in order to, and they're swinging for the fences, I would say, in terms of the level of scientific risk that's being taken. And they are very much dedicated to bringing the next wave of innovation through that pipeline and ultimately to patients.
How strong is the research pipeline, and on what indications are the largest portions of that funding being spent?
Well, the pipeline for large pharma is always a mix of internally discovered drugs, as well as those that they license in or acquire from outside. In our report, we talk about the fact that emerging biopharma companies, these are ones that we estimate spend less than $200 million a year on R&D. That cohort of companies globally accounts for about 2/3 of the total pipeline of molecules that are in clinical development. Some of those molecules will be held on to by those emerging biopharma companies all the way through to regulatory submission and even launch, and actually a larger percentage are. But there's still a large number that end up in the late stage pipelines of larger pharma companies that take them across the finish line and then into the marketplace. So I think, again, we see the pipeline for the industry is at an all-time high level. It's similar level to what it's been the last couple of years, but there's over 6,000 molecules in active development. There's plenty of science to go around, and that does translate into these very high levels of activity.
There is a notable geographic shift in where innovation is occurring. To a large extent, this reflects the growing role of China-headquartered companies. What's happened in that regard?
So we started seeing the shift in early stage funding towards China, 5 to 10 years ago, and there's also been a significant investment and commitment by the government there to support the development of the life sciences industry. There's been also significant, shall we say, modernization of the regulatory system there. And the market for innovative medicines has also become more attractive in recent years. All of that adds up to a very active life sciences sector there that is increasingly bringing drugs into the clinical development pipeline and advancing them, sometimes on their own, sometimes in partnership with other companies. Some of them destined really only for the China market, others destined for US and European markets as well. But we do think this is a trend that is sort of catching up with the rest of us. We also note in the report that at the same time, China's taking a larger share of the pipeline, 15% at the end of 2022, up from 6% 5 years earlier. Europe is seeing its share of the pipeline decline. It's gone down from 27% of the total to 23% over that 5-year period. And I think this is these are trends that we should all be aware of. And I know that Europe is not going to cede its place in the queue of and its contribution to innovation. But China is definitely gaining momentum, and importantly, I think has a lot to contribute globally to the advancement of medicine and bringing new and more diverse therapeutics to patients.
You talked about the role emerging biopharma is playing in building the pipeline. These companies are now responsible for 2/3 of the molecules in the pipeline, up from about half. Does this reflect the continuation of large pharma externalizing research and relying more on acquiring rather than discovering new molecules?
I think we've come through a period where the ability to set up and fund early stage biotech companies, often coming out of academic institutions, many in the Massachusetts and Boston, Cambridge area, that has all become easier to do. And again, we've seen this steady increase in the flow of venture funding, that started 15, 20 years ago. And I think, the capital markets have enabled these companies to stay independent longer and to provide rewards to the investors. So their share of the preclinical activity has increased. I think also we should recognize that a lot of the pipeline comprises of drugs that are either for rare diseases or for relatively small target patient populations that also often have relatively few prescribers. Therefore, when it comes to launching and commercializing a drug, the need for that large multi-thousand sales force that large pharma can contribute isn't as great for many of the companies. So I think this is all contributing to not only more companies being established out of academia, but also them holding on to their assets longer and not necessarily needing either the deep pockets nor the sales force of a large pharma partner.
There was also a drop in new drug approvals and launches. Again, the report cast this as a return to pre-COVID levels, but I'm thinking in regards to approvals, there's such a long time frame to work up to that. Would that be a result of COVID?
Well, the drop that we reported in 2022 was significant. We had 64 novel active substances launched globally for the first time last year. That was down from 93 the year before. We did take a look at what really drove that difference, and part of it is fewer COVID vaccines or therapeutics were approved last year than in 2021, which is when the bulk of activity came through. We also had fewer drugs launched for the first time in China. So these are coming out of China-based companies, and those numbers fell in 2022. We also saw fewer drugs being approved by the US FDA under the accelerated approval pathway. That's a pathway that's been getting more scrutiny in recent times. We're not sure that's the reason, but we did notice that there were fewer of those accelerated approvals last year. So add those three factors up and they do account for the bulk of that decline. 64, by the way, is still a very strong number. And if you go back pre-pandemic, we've been in the 40s to 50s. We had 60 in 2018. 64 in 2022 is still a very strong level of output from the industry's pipeline.
The pandemic did fuel the use of technology and innovative approaches. What do you see as the biggest changes, and how lasting an effect do you think they'll have on drug development and drug discovery?
Yeah, so we definitely saw this surge forward in terms of technology being used really across the healthcare system, from telemedicine to remote monitoring of patients and so on. We are seeing those technology tools increasingly being applied in the conduct of clinical trials, as indeed they were applied in some of the COVID-19 related trials. So we expect we'll see more utilization of technology in clinical trials that enables trials to be conducted with perhaps less burden to the to the trial participant, to the patient, less burden to the investigators conducting those trials. They also allow more extensive monitoring of the patient during the course of the trial, particularly if a patient is being constantly monitored. That produces an entire stream of data as opposed to what gets collected periodically when someone visits the investigator or has their blood drawn. So we think that this technology incorporated into trials is a trend that is going to strengthen. There is a lot of hope that it will result in faster trials. Certainly, we saw very fast trials in the case of the COVID vaccines. And outside of that, we still have a long way to go. It's still more than 11 years from the time that a new drug is first patented to the time that it receives regulatory approval. And that's a median time for the cohort new drugs launched in 2022. So we've still got a ways to go to get those numbers down, but I think there's a lot of effort around to accelerate clinical development, to do it efficiently, ultimately to bring those new therapies through the development cycle and to patients faster.
There's been a lot of focus on diversifying clinical trial participation. I think one of the most surprising things in the report is, despite the public attention and the efforts from regulators and trial sponsors, there's been a decline in both Black and African American and Hispanic patient representation. What's happened there?
I think we're at a point between a lot of activity, attention, and focus being placed on this, and seeing that show up in the data that is publicly available. And what we reported in our report was coming off of the clinicaltrials.gov website for completed trials where the data has been, where the trial has completed and the data has been uploaded. There's sometimes or there can be a year lag in that reporting. So when we looked at that, we were also surprised, frankly, to see the further decline in the representation in trials, including those trials that only had U.S. sites, because we know that part of the complication in looking at some of these metrics is the role that global trials play. But even for trials that are only conducted with U.S. sites, we saw the representation level decline. We are hopeful that we'll see that turnaround within the next year or two show up, and that will show up in the reported data. Because we know that a lot of effort is going into this. A lot of commitments have been made, both financial commitments and performance commitments. And we do see a lot of progress in terms of the collaboration between sites and patient organizations, with sponsors support, with CROs supporting these efforts as well. There's a lot going on around the country to try to get at this issue. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen spontaneously. It'll take some time, and then there is this lag factor in the reporting. But we're watching this very closely, and we'll be staying on top of it.
I want to ask you about clinical trial productivity, but before you talk about that, can you explain how you measure clinical development productivity and a component of that, which is clinical trial complexity?
So we have tried to come up with a way to systematically look across the industry and really all of the clinical trial activity to measure what we call productivity. There are many measures of productivity, and I should say at the outset, we don't claim ours to be perfect or ideal, but it's a metric that we've been able to come up with and used for a few years. What we basically are looking at is comparing inputs and outputs, and we frame the output in terms of success rates, and that means a molecule moving from one phase of clinical development to the next, whether it's phase 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to regulatory submission to approval. So that's what we think of as the output, and then we compare that output to the input, which we measure as the complexity of a trial with its duration. The complexity we define based on 5 variables that, in our experience, do contribute to both cost and effort to conduct a trial. There are also 5 variables that where there is data available, because we are constrained by that in doing this sort of analysis. The 5 variables, the number of subjects in the trial, the eligibility criteria for the trial, the number of trial sites, the number of countries that the trial's being run in, and the number of endpoints incorporated into the trial design. So we take those factors, we sum them up, we multiply that by the duration of the trial to come up with a metric for the effort or input, if you like, that goes into the trial that we then compare to the success rate in order to come up with a productivity index.
Well, what's happened in terms of clinical development productivity? You did see an increase there. What's responsible for that increase?
Right. So we actually saw a pretty strong uptick in productivity in 2022. When we dug into it, it is mostly due to fewer subjects being enrolled in trials in 2022. And that in itself is very much linked to the pandemic, right? So we saw these very large vaccine trials. A few years ago, we saw the large Ebola trials, which also enrolled large numbers of subjects. But COVID-19 really accentuated that. We're sort of off the high of those trials now, and that is what brought down the number of subjects that were included in trials. But we also did see some less dramatic but still important reduction in the number of sites, the number of countries, and the number of eligibility criteria. The number of endpoints has stayed pretty stable, and that's actually been rising for a few years because we know that in that sense, trials are becoming more complex. But the big swing factor, if you like, was the reduction in the number of subjects.
Is there any reason to believe that this will be sustained?
I think we're likely to see a return to the trend line. Looking ahead, the other big variable clearly is the success rate, the numerator, if you like, in that equation. There too, we've seen a decline in the composite success rate over the past several years, and it reached a low point in 2022 of 6.3%. One way to look at that is the fact that sponsors are taking more scientific risk. They are swinging for the fences when they move molecules through clinical development. What you're looking for, of course, is a high fast failure rate, right, as measured in phase 1 trials or early phase 2 trials. What you want to see is the highest success rate in phase 3 trials because those are the most expensive and they take the longest. We're seeing some positive trend there. We saw the phase 2 success rate actually tick up in 2022 and a slight uptick in phase 3 success rates as well. Phase 1 declined, which again can be viewed as a good thing, but that then pushed down our composite success rate to the low point of 6.3%. I think we're going to continue to see companies taking these risks. What we think is important is that there's a equal priority being given to trying to lower the operational risk associated with these trials, which in some ways can help offset that higher scientific risk. And that's where the role of technology, decentralization of trials, using novel trial designs, real-world data, and even using AI in some areas can be very helpful in reducing that operational risk that we still see at a relatively high level.
You mentioned AI. There's a lot of excitement around AI these days in drug development. How broadly is AI being adopted, and is there evidence that this is cutting the time and cost of R&D, or reason to believe it'll do so in a sustained and meaningful way going forward?
Well, we certainly hear a lot about AI. We hear a lot more than we sort of see in terms of clear evidence of either its use or its impact. But but it's moving, and we're seeing the green shoots, if you like, of this. We included in our report the fact that we can now track at least 19 molecules that are now in the pipeline for clinical development that came out of AI platforms in the discovery research stage. And that's an important area that's getting a lot of attention and focus. And again, we can see tangibly the results of that in terms of drugs coming through. We also know that AI is being used more extensively when it comes to site selection, investigator prioritization, and patient recruitment. And it's the anecdotes are positive, the pilots are positive. There is definitely a benefit to be seen there. We're not yet seeing it move the needle overall at an industry level, but I think there's enough effort and investment and enthusiasm for AI as an enabler of improved productivity that we'll be seeing a lot more of that in the coming years.
Murray Aitken, Executive Director of the IQVIA Institute for Human Data Science. Murray, thanks as always for your time.
Hey, you're very welcome. Enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.